The phone rang just as Emma was finishing the last of the breakfast dishes. She glanced at the caller ID and sighed. It was Patricia, her mother-in-law. Emma wiped her hands on a towel and answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Emma, dear." Patricia's voice came through, warm but slightly hurried. "Would you mind picking up some sausage on your way? I completely forgot. We'll need it for the table tonight." Emma pressed the phone closer to her ear. Patricia's tone carried that blend of affection and command Emma had grown used to over the years. She nodded, though Patricia couldn't see her. "Of course, Mom. I'll grab some before we head out." "Thank you, sweetheart. You know how Mark loves it. We'll see you soon." Patricia's breath wheezed slightly, age and years of work behind every word, but her excitement for the gathering was unmistakable. When the call ended, Emma set the phone down and leaned against the counter. The idea of driving out to the family's summer cabin for Patricia's birthday filled her with dread. She could already picture it. The long table set up under the porch lights, relatives chatting over each other, stories that had been told 100 times before. The endless parade of plates, dishes, and glasses that she, as the daughter-in-law, would inevitably help carry back and forth. She would have rather spent the evening walking through the neighborhood park with Mark, watching the sun set behind the trees, listening to the steady crunch of gravel beneath their shoes. Those walks were rare now, almost non-existent, but the thought of them still warmed her. Anything would be better than sitting trapped at a table while everyone around her filled the air with words she could neither connect with nor escape. Patricia lived for these gatherings. Even when the family wasn't physically together, she bridged the distance with nightly phone calls. Her sisters, Debbie and Kate, were spread out in different parts of the Midwest, but that hardly mattered. Every evening Patricia settled into her favorite armchair, a notepad and pen on the side table, and dialed their numbers in turn. Hours slipped by in a chorus of shared updates. The weather in Columbus, a new recipe someone had tried in Indianapolis, a neighbor's retirement in Dayton. To Patricia, these conversations were the lifeblood of family, the threads that stitched them together despite the miles. To Emma, they were incomprehensible. She had grown up in a different kind of household, quiet, distant, where her own mother seldom asked how her day had gone. Her older brother had drifted into his own life years ago. Phone calls with Emma's family were short, efficient, sometimes weeks apart. She could not understand what drove Patricia to linger on the phone for hours, sighing, laughing, even crying over stories that to Emma seemed trivial. When she overheard Patricia ending a call with a gentle, "We'll talk again tomorrow," Emma often rolled her eyes. She thought of it as wasted time, the kind of chatter people filled their lives with when they had nothing better to do. Yet to Mark it was normal. He had grown up listening to the hum of his mother's voice traveling through the house every night, as constant as the ticking of the kitchen clock. Emma envied, in a way she would never admit, that kind of devotion. But envy did not soften the suffocation she felt whenever Patricia announced another gathering. This weekend there would be no escape. Patricia was turning 68, and the whole family was expected. Aunt Debbie, with her relentless energy and loud laughter, was already on her way. Aunt Kate, poised and graceful, would arrive by afternoon. Patricia's husband Robert had been marinating meat for the grill since dawn. The celebration was set to last not just one evening, but the entire weekend. Emma dragged her suitcase from the closet, setting it on the bed with a dull thud. The thought of packing felt like tying herself into a role she no longer wanted to play. She folded a few dresses mechanically, her mind far from the fabric in her hands. She remembered summers past, how Mark used to laugh with her in the car, turning up the radio, holding her hand at stoplights. They would talk about everything then, dreams, frustrations, silly jokes. Somewhere along the way, the conversations had faded. Now, silence filled the car rides, broken only by Patricia's calls checking on their arrival. Emma closed the suitcase and zipped it shut, a finality in the sound. She stood still for a moment, staring at the packed bag, her chest tightening. Tonight, She would sit at a table surrounded by people who shared blood and stories that didn't include her. She would smile, pass plates, and pretend she belonged. But deep inside, she longed for something else. Not laughter spilling across a crowded porch. Not stories that circled endlessly like moths around a lamp. What she wanted was simpler. A quiet walk with Mark, his hand steady in hers. No words needed, no roles to perform. Emma lifted the suitcase from the bed, placed it by the door, and took a deep breath. The road to the cabin in Ohio awaited, and with it, another round of cheerful voices she did not recognize as her own. Her heart was already heavy. The sun was already dipping westward by the time Mark steered the car onto I-71, heading out of Cleveland toward the quiet stretch of Ohio countryside. The highway unspooled ahead, gray asphalt lined with green fields and scattered patches of forest. The hum of the tires filled the car, steady and constant, like a reminder of how long the ride would feel. Emma leaned her head against the passenger side window, watching the scenery shift from city blocks to rolling farmland. A red barn flashed past, then a cluster of grazing cows, then rows of tall corn swaying in the late summer wind. In other years, these details might have stirred conversation between her and Mark. He would have pointed out a funny billboard, or she would have teased him about missing an exit. Now, silence hung between them. She opened the worn copy of Pride and Prejudice she had tucked into her bag. The spine was cracked, the pages softened from years of rereading. She knew the story by heart, but it offered a kind of comfort, a reminder of a time when she still believed in conversations that never ended. Her eyes followed the familiar words, but they blurred as her chest tightened. A tear slid down her cheek. She brushed it away quickly, hoping Mark hadn't noticed. He had. His eyes flicked from the road to her for the briefest moment. "You've read that one before," he said flatly. "I have," she whispered. "So why again?" His tone wasn't cruel, just disinterested, as if her answer mattered little. Emma tightened her grip on the book, because sometimes it feels different the second, third, or 10th time. Mark gave a small shrug and focused on the road. The silence settled back in, heavier than before. She thought about the early days of their relationship, long drives where the miles flew by because they couldn't stop talking. They had filled the car with laughter, plans, even silly arguments about music stations. She could still remember one evening when they drove home from a small town fair, the windows down, her hair whipping in the wind, both of them singing off-key to a song neither of them knew all the words to. Back then, every mile felt too short. Now, each mile stretched endlessly. Up ahead, a semi-truck barreled into their lane without signaling. Mark slammed the horn and jerked the wheel just in time. The tires screeched against the pavement as the car veered slightly onto the shoulder. Emma gasped, clutching the door handle. "Watch it!" Mark shouted, though his voice was directed more at the disappearing truck than at her. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel. These drivers, who even gave them licenses? Emma's heart hammered in her chest. She sat back slowly, trying to steady her breathing. For a moment, she thought Mark might reach over, touch her hand, reassure her. But he only shook his head, muttering about reckless truckers, before returning to the steady monotone of the highway. She turned back to her book, though the words swam in front of her eyes. All she could see was the widening distance between them, a distance measured not in miles but in words left unsaid. Outside, the world shifted as the suburbs gave way to stretches of pine and oak. The late summer evening draped the landscape in gold. A small lake flashed between the trees, its surface catching the last light of day, ripples shining like broken glass. Fireflies would soon begin their dance in the fields, but Emma doubted she'd be watching them. A sign on the roadside announced their exit. Mark turned off the highway, guiding the car onto a narrower two-lane road that wound through the woods. The air felt different here, cooler, thicker with the scent of pine. Houses grew fewer and farther apart, replaced by cabins and small farms. Emma shifted in her seat, closing the book and resting it in her lap. The closer they drew to the cabin, the heavier she felt. She imagined the porch already lit with string lights, the table crowded with dishes, Patricia standing proudly in the center, ready to fuss over everyone. By the time the car rolled down the gravel driveway, night had settled fully. The headlights swept across the familiar cabin, wooden siding glowing under the porch lights, a small vegetable garden along the fence. Patricia was there, just as Emma had pictured, standing by the gate with a wide smile. She lifted a hand to wave, her eyes bright with joy at seeing her son and daughter-in-law arrive. Robert stepped out from the porch behind her, his posture steady, his expression welcoming. Emma managed a faint smile in return, though her stomach knotted tighter. She gathered her bag from the back seat, stepped out onto the gravel, and breathed in the scent of pine and wood smoke. The evening air pressed around her, warm yet heavy, as Patricia hurried forward to greet them. Emma knew the weekend had only just begun. Patricia's arms were open before Emma had even closed the car door. "You made it," she said, her voice full of relief and delight. She hugged Mark tightly, patting his back as though he were still the boy who used to run barefoot across her yard. Then she turned to Emma with the same eagerness, wrapping her in a warm embrace. "You must be tired from the drive," Patricia said, pulling back to study Emma's face. "Come inside, dear. Supper's waiting." Robert appeared behind his wife, tall and steady despite the years that had lined his face. His handshake was firm, his smile quiet but genuine. "Good to see you both," he said. "I've got some lemonade on ice. Let's get you settled." The house smelled of roasted chicken, grilled vegetables, and with smoke from the fireplace. Candles glowed on the kitchen counter, and the dining table had been carefully set, every fork and glass aligned. Patricia's pride in her home showed in every detail. Emma stepped inside, suitcase still in hand, and felt the weight of expectation pressed down. The warmth of the cabin should have been comforting. Walls paneled in cedar, soft rugs beneath her feet, a fire crackling gently in the hearth. Instead, it made her feel exposed, as though she'd walked into a space that belonged to everyone but her. She had been part of this family for years now, yet the distance between her and Patricia never seemed to shrink. Patricia was unfailingly kind, always ready with a smile, a recipe, a question about Emma's work. But beneath it lingered a barrier Emma couldn't explain. Maybe it was because Patricia still saw her son as the center of every story, every gathering. Maybe it was because Emma's silences had slowly become walls. Whatever the reason, even in Patricia's embrace, Emma felt like an outsider. As she sat down at the table, the memory came back sharp and uninvited. It was 4 years ago. She had been pregnant, just far enough along to let her heart believe in a future. Mark had painted the spare room a pale yellow. Patricia had knit a blanket, her hands working tirelessly each night. Emma remembered the first flutter she had felt inside her, a spark of life that had made her cry and laugh all at once. Then came the appointments, the doctor's furrowed brow, the cautious words about complications. Emma clung to hope until the day it all ended. The miscarriage broke something in her. Nights blurred into mornings with no sleep. She moved through the house like a shadow, unable to speak of what she had lost. Friends offered condolences, but the words felt hollow. Mark, though devastated, retreated into silence. He worked longer hours, buried himself in books and projects, as if by keeping busy he could escape the grief pressing in on them. For weeks, Emma sat alone in their bedroom, curtains drawn, the blanket Patricia had knitted folded uselessly at the end of the bed. When Mark tried to comfort her, his words stumbled. When he stayed away, she hurt even more. They circled each other in grief, never finding the right way to meet in the middle. The years since had dulled the rawness, but not the distance it carved. Love remained, but it was quieter now, stripped of the laughter and the easy closeness they once shared. Conversations had become rare. replaced by nods, shrugs, and silence. Where there should have been connection, there was only absence. Emma forced herself back into the present as Patricia set a steaming bowl of potatoes on the table. "I thought you'd like these," she said cheerfully. "Mark always did." Emma smiled politely. "They look wonderful, thank you." Robert poured lemonade into her glass. "We're glad you're here, Emma. It means a lot to Patricia." The sincerity in his voice stung. She wished she could feel what he seemed to assume she did, a sense of belonging, of family. Instead, she felt like a guest, careful with her words, cautious with her expressions, always aware that this was not truly her space. Outside, the crickets had begun their chorus, a low hum that filled the silence between sentences. Mark sat at the table, already half absorbed in his phone, nodding absently as Patricia asked him questions. He looked comfortable at home. Emma studied his face, wondering when he had become so distant from her, yet so anchored here. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around her like a blanket she hadn't asked for. The fire popped softly, shadows danced across the walls, and Patricia's laughter rang out as she recalled some story from years past. Emma lifted her fork, but the food turned to ash on her tongue. Everyone else seemed to belong. She alone felt misplaced. Emma set her fork down carefully, her gaze drifting to the window where the last streaks of daylight faded into night. She pressed her palm to the cool glass, as if the darkness outside might offer her an escape the inside never could. In a house full of light and family, Emma felt utterly alone. The next morning, the sound of gravel crunching under tires broke through the stillness of the cabin yard. Emma looked out the window just in time to see a silver minivan pull up. The doors flew open, and before anyone could even step outside to greet her, Aunt Debbie was already calling out, "Patricia, you wouldn't believe the traffic on I-71. I thought we'd never make it." Her voice carried across the yard, bright and booming, filling every corner before she even reached the porch. Debbie bustled forward, her arms full of bags and containers. Behind her trailed her husband, moving at a slower pace, carrying a cooler in one hand and giving Robert a polite nod. Debbie reached the porch and set everything down in one sweeping motion, barely pausing to breathe. "I brought potato salad, a pie, some lemonade, and oh, don't let me forget, I picked up those seeds you wanted from the farm stand. We'll get them in the ground before the weekend's over." Emma, standing just inside the doorway, flinched at the sheer energy radiating off her. Debbie's presence was like a flood that left no room untouched. She was already fussing over Patricia, hugging her tightly, adjusting the bags, giving instructions to her husband, and commenting on the state of the garden all at once. "She never stops," Emma murmured under her breath. Mark, who had stepped beside her, gave a small smile. "That's Aunt Debbie. Always has been." To Emma, it felt overwhelming. Debbie seemed incapable of silence. Her voice filled the house as she inspected the kitchen, made a list of things to rearrange, and offered to help cook, clean, and fix whatever wasn't broken. Her hands moved constantly, peeling apples, wiping counters, adjusting the curtains, as though stillness would undo her. Emma sat quietly on the edge of the couch, her hands folded, watching. The noise pressed on her temples. Debbie's laughter was too loud, her footsteps too quick, her suggestions too constant. The longer Emma listened, the more suffocated she felt. By early afternoon, another car pulled up, this one sleek and black. Aunt Kate stepped out slowly, her posture straight, her movements deliberate. She wore a long navy coat that seemed too formal for the summer warmth, yet she carried it with such ease that it looked natural. Her silver hair was styled neatly, her lipstick a muted rose. She walked with measured grace, each step purposeful. "Patricia," she said softly, presenting a bouquet of roses. "Happy birthday, dear." Patricia's eyes lit up. "Kate, you didn't have to. They're beautiful." Emma studied her from a distance. Kate exuded elegance without effort. She spoke in a calm, steady tone, never rushing, never raising her voice. Where Debbie was all movement and noise, Kate was stillness and composure. She seemed untouchable, like a figure cut out of a more refined world. For a moment, Emma admired her. She envied the way Kate commanded attention without needing to demand it. Even her silence seemed meaningful. But admiration quickly twisted into something sharper. Emma tugged at the hem of her t-shirt, suddenly conscious of how plain she looked in comparison. Next to Kate's polished demeanor, she felt clumsy, unremarkable. The aunts soon gathered with Patricia in the living room, voices overlapping as stories poured out. Debbie recounted every detail of her drive as though it were a great adventure. Kate listened politely, adding thoughtful remarks here and there, her presence steady like an anchor in Debbie's storm. Patricia beamed, thrilled to have her sisters around her. Emma hovered at the edge of the group, smiling when expected but saying little. The conversation flowed without her. It was a rhythm established long before she had entered the family. Shared childhood memories, inside jokes, shorthand references that meant nothing to her. Across the room, Mark sat in an armchair, a book propped open in his hands. He nodded absently when Debbie called his name, but his eyes never left the page. It was as if he had found his refuge in print, safe from the whirlwind of chatter. Emma glanced at him, frustration stirring. How easily he slipped away, hidden behind cover, while she sat exposed, enduring the noise and the ache of not belonging. The voices swelled, laughter bouncing off the wooden walls. Debbie was already planning the evening meal. Kate was suggesting a walk by the lake. Patricia was fussing about where everyone would sleep. The house felt smaller with every word, every gesture, every reminder that this family spoke a language Emma could never fully grasp. She folded her arms across her chest, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the woods stood quiet, still untouched by the commotion within. She longed for that silence, for the calm she remembered from walks with Mark when the world outside the two of them seemed far away. But now, surrounded by voices that weren't hers and silences that didn't comfort, Emma felt herself retreating further into the shadows of the room. She had never felt more alone in a house so full of people. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall pines surrounding the cabin, casting dappled shadows across the yard. Inside, the house hummed with activity, Patricia and Kate arranging dishes in the kitchen, Debbie bustling from room to room with unstoppable energy. Mark had settled in the living room, his phone glowing faintly in his hands, eyes glued to the screen. Emma lingered nearby, her arms crossed, watching him. He looked so at ease, detached from the noise around them. She wanted to break through that wall, to draw him back into her world. "Do you remember," she began softly, "that weekend at the lake when we first started dating? You rented that little rowboat, and we got soaked because you didn't know how to paddle." Mark chuckled, faintly, not looking up. "Yeah, sure," he murmured, scrolling through whatever had his attention. Emma's heart sank. She had expected more, laughter, a smile that reached his eyes, some sign that he remembered it the way she did, a memory alive with color. Instead, his voice carried the same flat disinterest he gave to the weather forecast. She bit her lip. "It was one of my favorite days," she added, almost to herself. Mark mumbled something indistinct, his thumb still sliding across the screen. The air between them thickened with silence. Emma could feel the old ache stirring, the familiar realization that she was speaking into a void. She wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand that he look at her the way he once had. Instead, she said, "Let's take a walk. By the lake. Just us." That finally made him lift his eyes. He hesitated, as if calculating how long it would take, what he might miss on his phone. Then he nodded. "All right, just for a bit." They stepped outside into the warm air, the scent of pine stronger now. The path wound down toward the water, lined with wildflowers and the faint buzz of cicadas. Emma walked close to him, her shoulder brushing his arm, hoping he would take her hand. He didn't. When they reached the lake, Its surface shimmered under the late afternoon light. The air was cooler here, touched by the water's breath. Emma paused at the shore, her eyes catching movement near the reeds. A cluster of ducklings trailed after their mother, tiny specks of brown fluff pressed together as they paddled along the edge. Her face lit up. "Look, Mark," she said, pointing. "A whole family. Aren't they sweet?" He followed her finger, glanced at the ducks and shrugged. "They're just ducks, Emma. Nothing special." Her smile faltered. She had wanted to share that spark of wonder, that simple joy, the way they once did. His dismissal cut sharper than he could know. "Not everything has to be ordinary," she whispered. Mark frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Never mind," she said quickly, turning away. But her chest tightened, anger rising to the surface. They walked a few more steps in silence before Emma stopped abruptly. "This is what I mean," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't see me anymore. You don't hear me." Mark looked startled. "Emma, that's not fair. Of course I see you. Do you? Because most of the time it feels like you're more interested in a screen than in me." He opened his mouth, then closed it again, words failing him. His face reddened, his hands restless at his sides. Emma's frustration boiled over. "Forget it," she snapped, spinning on her heel. She strode back up the path, her footsteps crunching against the gravel. Mark called after her. "Emma, wait," but she didn't. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. The trees blurred around her as she pushed forward, her chest burning with the weight of what she hadn't said for years. When she finally slowed, she realized she wasn't alone. A figure stood a little way off, half hidden near the path. Aunt Debbie had been walking her bike toward the lake, and now she paused, her sharp eyes taking in what had just happened. Emma froze, her anger mingling with sudden embarrassment. Debbie's gaze was not unkind, but it was knowing, heavy with the judgment of someone who had already seen too much. "Everything all right, honey?" Debbie asked, her voice softer than usual. Emma forced a tight smile. "Fine, Shalit. Just needed some air." Debbie tilted her head, clearly unconvinced, but she said nothing more. She wheeled her bike past, her footsteps crunching in the gravel, leaving Emma alone with the echo of her own words. Behind her, Mark still lingered by the lake, staring after her with an expression caught between frustration and regret. Emma wrapped her arms around herself and kept walking, wishing she could outrun not just the moment, but the hollow silence that had become their marriage. Dinner, that evening, stretched long into the night. The dining table groaned under platters of roasted chicken, potato salad, fresh bread, and pies that Debbie had brought. Glasses clinked, voices overlapped, and laughter swelled until it seemed to push against the wooden beams of the cabin ceiling. Emma sat among them, a smile fixed carefully on her face. She passed dishes when asked, nodded politely at stories, and forced out small laughs at jokes she barely understood. The family's joy was genuine, warm and full, but it did not reach her. She felt like a photograph placed in the wrong album, present but not belonging. Across the table, Mark leaned toward his mother, listening as Patricia recounted a memory from his childhood. He laughed, his expression softening in a way Emma hadn't seen directed at her in years. Debbie kept up a steady stream of chatter, while Robert added calm interjections, his voice steady like an anchor. Even Kate, quieter than the others, contributed in measured tones that drew nods of respect. Emma lifted her fork to her lips, the food bland against her tongue. No one was unkind to her. On the contrary, they included her in every toast, every invitation to share. But she felt invisible all the same, as if her absence would hardly be noticed. When the plates were finally cleared and the family began to scatter, some drifting to the living room, others stepping outside to stretch their legs, Emma excused herself. She slipped out onto the porch, where the air was cooler, heavy with the scent of pine. String lights stretched above her, glowing like captive fireflies, casting a soft golden hue across the worn wooden boards. Emma sank into one of the rocking chairs, folding her arms around herself. The laughter inside continued, muffled through the walls, a sound from another world. She tilted her head back, staring at the dark Ohio sky. The stars were faint through the haze of summer, but the quiet pressed against her ears in a way that was both comforting and crushing. She blinked rapidly, forcing back tears. The screen door creaked open. Soft footsteps approached. Aunt Kate emerged, carrying a mug of tea in her hands. She moved with her usual unhurried grace, as if even the night itself slowed to accommodate her pace. "Mind if I sit?" Kate asked. Emma shook her head. "Of course not." Kate lowered herself into the chair beside her, setting the mug carefully on the armrest. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound the distant hum of crickets. Then Kate spoke. "You've been quiet tonight." Emma gave a weak laugh. Everyone else had enough to say. No one missed my voice. Kate studied her, eyes calm but piercing. "Silence can mean many things," she said. "Sometimes it's peace. Sometimes it's pain. And sometimes it's simply a habit." Emma turned toward her, startled by the accuracy. "Mark and we don't talk the way we used to. He's always reading or working. And when I try, it feels like he's somewhere else entirely." Kate nodded slowly. There are different kinds of silence between two people. There's the silence that crackles, full of words unspoken, the kind that weighs heavy and unsettled. There's the silence that grows because one person has spoken too much and the other is weary of listening. And then there's the silence that feels like companionship. That one is rare, but it's worth waiting for. Emma's throat tightened. What if we never reach that kind? What if this is all we have left? Kate sipped her tea, then set it down again. "Then you have to decide what you truly need. Men aren't mind readers, Emma. If you want him to listen, to share, you must tell him plainly. Say, I need you to sit with me for an hour each evening. No phone, no book. Just us." He may resist at first, but if you're honest and consistent, he'll learn. He loves you. He just doesn't always know how to show it. Emma pressed her lips together, fighting the tremor in her chin. "I shouldn't have to ask. He should just know." Kate reached over, her hand warm against Emma's arm. That's a dangerous hope. Even in the best marriages, unspoken needs remain unmet. Say the words, Emma. Give him the chance to hear you. The tears Emma had been holding back spilled over. She lowered her head into her hands, shoulders shaking. "I feel like I've been disappearing," she whispered, little by little, and no one notices. Kate rubbed her arm gently, her presence steady. "I notice, and I believe Mark does too, even if he doesn't show it well. Don't give up on him before you've given him the chance to understand." For the first time all evening, Emma felt seen. She let the tears fall freely, the night air cool against her damp cheeks. Beside her, Kate remained silent, not the silence of avoidance, but the kind that steadied rather than weighed. A silence that said, "You're not alone." The night deepened around the cabin, quiet settling in after the day's noise. Inside, the last echoes of laughter had faded into muted conversations and the occasional creak of floorboards. Out on the porch, Emma remained in her chair, the string lights above her glowing faintly, their bulbs haloed in golden mist. She drew her knees to her chest, staring into the darkness beyond the yard. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the crickets carrying on their endless song. She didn't notice the screen door open again until the faintest shuffle of footsteps reached her ears. When she turned, Mark was there, holding 2 steaming mugs. He hesitated, almost awkward, before stepping closer. "I made cocoa," he said quietly, setting one mug on the small table beside her. Emma blinked at him. "Cocoa? At midnight?" He gave a faint smile, almost sheepish. "I remembered you used to love it late at night. Thought maybe you still did. Her eyes dropped to the mug, curls of steam rising into the cool air. What struck her more than the gesture was what wasn't in his hands. No phone, no book. For once, his pockets looked heavy only with his own hands, shoved there nervously. He had left the screen behind. Mark lowered himself into the chair beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emma wrapped her hands around the mug, the warmth seeping into her palms, and tried to steady her breath. Finally, she asked softly, "Why now?" He leaned back, his gaze fixed on the porch railing. "Because I realized I'd been sitting in the same house as you for years and somehow missing you anyway. Tonight, I didn't want to miss you." The words settled between them like fragile glass. Emma's throat tightened. She had wanted to hear something like this for so long, but now that it came, she didn't know how to hold it. They sat in the glow of the string lights, and slowly, conversation began to flow. At first, it was hesitant, weather, work, small things they had skimmed over for months. But soon it deepened, tugging loose old memories. They laughed about the camping trip where their tent collapsed in the rain, about the time Emma burned cookies so badly the fire alarm had woken the neighbors. Emma found herself leaning toward him, her voice softer, her smile unguarded. The rhythm felt familiar, like music she hadn't heard in years, yet still remembered the steps to. Mark listened more than he spoke, nodding, even asking questions. His eyes, for once, stayed fixed on her. The hours slipped by unnoticed. Above them, the sky had shifted, stars brightening in the deep velvet night. Somewhere in the garden, a night breeze stirred the vines that Patricia had strung across the porch. A single sprig of jasmine, loosened by the wind, drifted down and landed in Emma's lap. She lifted it slowly, the petals pale and delicate in the lamplight, the scent sweet and familiar. For a fleeting moment, she was taken back to their early days together, when Mark used to bring her flowers he picked from roadside bushes, awkward but sincere. She remembered the first time he tucked one behind her ear, how he'd laughed nervously, cheeks red, as if such tenderness embarrassed him. Emma brushed the jasmine between her fingers, her heart aching with the memory. She looked at Mark, who was watching her quietly now. "It feels like a lifetime ago," she whispered. He reached over, taking the sprig from her hand gently. He laid it back into her palm, closing her fingers around it. "Maybe it doesn't have to be. Maybe we just forgot how to hold on." The porch lights flickered in the breeze, their glow steadying again. Emma felt something shift inside her. Not a sudden cure for years of silence, but a thread pulling them closer. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't speaking into emptiness. They sat there until the cocoa cooled, until the crickets gave way to the occasional call of an owl, until the house behind them went completely still. Words flowed like water long held back, spilling over, steady and healing. When Emma finally leaned her head against the back of her chair, exhaustion softening her, Mark reached for her hand. She let him, their fingers entwining with a familiarity that had almost been forgotten. It was fragile, this moment, but real, the beginning of something that might mend what had been broken. And under the quiet of the Ohio night, with a jasmine sprig resting in her lap, Emma felt hope stir where emptiness had lived for too long. The hours drifted past like slow-moving clouds. Emma and Mark remained on the porch, the mugs long emptied, their words weaving through the night. For every memory she offered, Mark responded with his own, tentative at first, then with growing ease. They spoke about the silly road trips they once took, the diner where they spent an entire evening over one slice of pie, the nights they stayed up until dawn because neither wanted to end the conversation. But as the laughter softened, Emma felt a tremor of fear. The moment was fragile, delicate as glass. She feared if she breathed too deeply, it would shatter. Happiness this sudden, this unexpected, felt like a soap bubble drifting in the air, beautiful, shimmering but destined to burst. Her voice trembled as she admitted, "I don't want this to be just tonight. I don't want us to slip back into silence tomorrow. Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. He laced his fingers through hers and held them tightly, as though anchoring her to the present. "I don't either," he said at last. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but certain. "I've been absent, Emma. I know it. I thought I was protecting myself, maybe protecting you, by staying quiet. But all I did was push us further apart." Emma's eyes glistened. For years, she had longed to hear him name the distance, to acknowledge the silence that had hollowed their marriage. Now, the simple truth of his words filled her with something stronger than relief. It was hope. Mark squeezed her hand. "I don't want that anymore. If it means setting the phone aside, shutting the books, carving out time just for us, I'll do it. I need to, because I don't want to lose you." Emma's breath caught. For so long, she had carried the weight of unspoken fears, convinced that he didn't notice her fading. To hear him say it, to hear him promise, felt like the beginning of something new. She leaned back, studying his face in the porch light. It was weary, lying more than when they first met, but his eyes were open now, searching hers. She nodded, pressing her palm more firmly into his. "Then let's try. Let's not let silence take more from us than it already has." Their words didn't form an official vow, but the weight of them lingered like a quiet promise, a covenant written not in ceremony but in shared resolve. Inside the cabin, the night carried on in a different rhythm. Patricia sat with Kate at the kitchen table, a pot of chamomile tea between them. The dishes had been washed, Robert had gone to bed, and Debbie's snoring already echoed faintly from the guest room. Patricia clasped her mug, staring out the window toward the porch where shadows of her son and daughter-in-law flickered under the string lights. Her voice was hushed, tinged with worry. "They've been so distant. For years, I thought maybe they were only staying together out of habit." Kate followed her gaze, her expression calm. "Habit can break people apart, but it can also be reshaped. I saw them tonight. Something shifted." Patricia sighed, her shoulders sinking. "I want so badly for them to find their way back. Emma, she tries, but I think she feels like she doesn't belong here. And Mark, he can be so withdrawn, like he's living half in another world." Kate set her hand gently on Patricia's. "Give them time. They're finding words again. And once two people relearn how to speak to each other, even in whispers, there's always hope." Patricia nodded, tears glinting in her eyes. "I just don't want my son to make the mistake of letting go when he doesn't have to." "Neither of them wants to let go," Kate said firmly. "I can see it. They've just forgotten how to hold on." Outside, Emma leaned into the chair, Mark's hand still entwined with hers. They had fallen into a quieter rhythm now, not out of avoidance, but out of peace. The silence between them was different, no longer heavy, but steady, filled with presence. Emma glanced at the jasmine sprig, still resting on the small table. Its fragrance lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable, like a reminder that even fragile things could last if tended to with care. The porch light buzzed softly. A breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the promise of morning. And for the first time in years, Emma felt that tomorrow might hold more than repetition. It might hold renewal. The night settled into stillness, but it was no longer the silence of distance. It was the silence of two people beginning to find their way back. Years passed as quietly and relentlessly as the seasons that rolled across the Ohio countryside. Summers gave way to autumns, winters to springs, until the calendar pages blurred into decades. The cabin by the lake remained, weathered but sturdy, its porch still strung with lights that glowed softly on warm nights. Emma and Mark had grown old together, their hair silvered, their movements slowed, yet they still found themselves drawn back to this place each summer. On this evening, they sat side by side on the porch, wrapped in a single wool blanket against the coolness that drifted from the water. Emma's hands, now thinner and lined with age, rested in her lap. Mark's hand lay gently over hers. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy with absence, but full of understanding. Above them, clouds drifted lazily across the summer sky. They shifted shapes, billowing towers, long ribbons stretched thin by the wind, reminding Emma of the way she used to imagine stories in their forms as a girl. She tilted her head toward Mark. His eyes followed the same horizon, a faint smile softening his features. The years had taken much from them. Patricia had been the first to go, her laughter fading into memory. Debbie followed not long after, her boundless energy silenced at last. Kate passed too, leaving behind only her wisdom, carried in the echoes of her advice. Each loss had been felt deeply, but their presence lingered in stories, in the rhythms of family traditions, in the very walls of the cabin that had once rung with their voices. Sometimes, on nights like this, Emma thought she could still hear Patricia humming in the kitchen, or see Debbie bustling with too many tasks at once, or catch Kate's steady gaze, calm and knowing. The house was emptier now, but never hollow. It held memory like the wood held warmth from the sun, quiet, enduring. Emma leaned back in her chair, the blanket pulled higher around her shoulders. "It's quiet," she said softly, though her voice carried no sadness. Mark nodded. "The good kind of quiet." She smiled at that. Once, she would have longed to fill the silence with words, desperate to break the distance. But now she knew the truth Kate had spoken years ago. Not all silences were the same. Some carried tension, some carried neglect. But this silence, the one they shared now, was woven from trust, from years of choosing to remain side by side even when words failed them. Mark shifted, tightening his hand around hers. "Do you remember that night?" he asked. His voice was raspy with age, but steady. Emma knew which one he meant. The night of cocoa and jasmine, when they had sat on this very porch and found each other again after so much distance. She nodded slowly. "I remember. I think that was the night everything changed." He chuckled softly. "Or maybe the night we finally stopped pretending we were fine and actually started trying." Emma's eyes crinkled with her smile. "Either way, it saved us." They sat in silence again, the rocking chairs creaking gently beneath them. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, their lights rising and fading like tiny lanterns. From the lake came the faint splash of a fish breaking the surface. The world felt unhurried, as though it too had grown old with them. Emma turned her head, studying the man beside her. His face was worn, his shoulders stooped, but he was still hers. All the years of silence, of struggle, of rediscovery had led them here, to a peace she would not trade for anything. The blanket shifted as Mark leaned closer, his voice just above a whisper. "I'm glad we learned how to be quiet together." Her chest swelled, her eyes stinging. She pressed her cheek against his shoulder. "Me too." Above them, the clouds drifted on, bathed in the fading light of summer. They stretched across the horizon, endless and gentle, as if carrying the weight of time itself. For Emma and Mark, there was nothing more to say. Their silence spoke all that needed to be spoken. And in that stillness, as the Ohio sky darkened and the first stars emerged, their love remained, quiet, steady, and enduring.